So if we compare this to the old school method, I got a pretty big gap here at the bottom of the lure that didn't come together. Even though I squeezed it in super tight and tried to make it fit together, we still got some pretty big gaps and some gaps at the top as well. It just never quite goes together perfectly. And when we compare that to the new school lure, you can see that I'll have a ton less work on getting the new school method together. All right guys, so now we're gonna do things the new school 3D printed way, the way I prefer to do things because we are 3D printing, right? We're not going to want to get involved in that gluing two halves together with alignment pins and having them come out wonky sometimes. Like, we don't need to do that. We're 3D printing, and I'm gonna show you how to make it happen. So this is our same twitch bait we've been working on the whole time. And what I'm gonna do here is I'm actually just gonna save this as a different name. And I could probably use some sort of versioning here, but really, like, I find this to be like way easier to do this way. I don't have to go back and forth with the versioning stuff that I frankly don't understand in Fusion. Okay, so now what we need to do is we're just gonna go back to the start of where we had our body and only our body, none of the details. And I can actually just destroy all of this stuff. Boom, because I don't need it anymore. It's old school, bro. We're going new school. So now what I want to do is, again, kind of go through the same process I did before, where I created a sketch on this plane and I start blocking out sections. Right, so let's block out the tail section here. So I'm just eyeballing this. There's probably a way better way to do this, by actually thinking about it ahead of time. That might be a good idea. But I kind of have a good idea of how I want this lure to perform. It's going to be a little bit heavier, sink a little bit more. And so I'm going to have a relatively small chamber at the top. And actually, maybe we'll do one solid just for the fun of it. Okay, so now what I want to do is, this is basically my front and back. Obviously, I want those to be solid because I'm going to be doing screw eyes here. And I want the belly to be relatively solid. So let's come in here and, what we'll do this time is we'll actually make a straight line instead of a curved line between here. And so this up here is going to be my hollow chamber. This will be solid, and that will be solid. And the other thing I want to do here is position my eye. I'm going to do a 10mm eye. And the reason I want to position it now is I want to make sure that I have access to this top cavity where it's going to be hollow. And the reason for that is we're 3D printing this thing. And so while we can print a completely encased hollow area, the resin in there is never really going to get cured, and we're not going to be able to put any rattles or anything in there because we'll have no access to it. It'll be completely sealed. So what I'm doing is using the eye feature, if you will, and I'm gonna put a hole all the way through the lure, and we're gonna kind of create an eye separately that will glue in place. But by leaving that hole there in the original lure, it's gonna allow me to clean out that hollow cavity, put any rattles or BBs I want into there, and then seal it back up. That's new school, bro. So obviously, you want to kind of align up your hollow part with your eye here. One quick note, if you don't want to put any rattles in here, you can always leave it hollow and then run like some holes from your pilot holes. The holes to clean this area out don't need to be very large. They can be relatively small. So sometimes if I just want it to sink at a certain rate, but not necessarily put rattles and stuff in there, you can use the small pilot holes to make those drain holes, if you will. Okay, so that looks good. We're gonna finish this sketch, and I'm gonna go and do exactly what we did last time, split body, boom. And I'm going to select my splitting tools, this guy and this guy. Since they're moving the same way, we can select multiple. I can't select this one because it doesn't intersect properly, but I can select these two because they intersect the same way. Click on OK, and we're gonna bring back our last sketch, and we're gonna take a look at our bodies. I can turn this one off, and I can turn this one off. And again, we wanna just go split this body, and this is my splitting line. OK, and hide that piece. All right, so now I have basically the part that I wanna hollow out. So the reason I split this up into parts is because when I go to shell this thing, it gives me very precise control over where I want this shelling to occur. I can shell the whole body and then maybe go back in and fill it in later, but this allows me to kind of break it apart, shell the specific part I want, and then I'll just put it back together using the join command. All right, so we're gonna shell this. We're gonna shell this body, and I'm gonna click on this flat side because I want this flat side to disappear. So when I click on that, and let's just say 1.5, it will shell, and this 1.5 is this thickness here. And you can play around with kind of multiple thicknesses. One thing, Fusion sucks at shelling stuff. It gets very picky. It won't overlap areas and make a hole in the middle to maintain that thickness. Once these things kind of smash together, it's just gonna fail. So we'll do 2. That seems pretty reasonable. I'll say okay. And again, totally making this up. And then what I want to do actually is, I think here, I'm going to go ahead and take out this bottom section, right? So if I turn that back on, we have basically 2 millimeters between our split line and here. I'm going to actually just make that a little bit bigger, and it's pretty simple. I'm just going to hit extrude. I'm going to come in and select this bottom face here, and I'm just going to pull it down and knock out that bottom area right there. Okay, so now when I come back in, you can see that that lines up with the line I drew. Again, I'm just kind of making this up from a performance standpoint. I don't really know how this thing is gonna float with this much air in it. But what I do have is a nice mass of material in the belly that should at least hold it vertically straight up when it's in there. And it might float a little bit, it might sink a little bit. We can adjust that with the number of ball bearings we put in there and some other ways. And I can always come back in here and, for example, undo that extrude I just put on there and make it heavier even still and less air volume. Okay, so that looks good there. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the bottom again. And let's go ahead and take care of our eye at this point, right? Now this kind of flows into details, which we'll cover in a future video, but in this particular design style, the eye hole is actually very important to the overall printing of the model. So we need to get that taken care of now instead of later. So I'm gonna hit extrude again, and this time I'm gonna make use of the fact that it chose the circle. And if I look in here, what I wanna do is make sure I take out all of that lure body, just like that. And in this case, I'm gonna do a new body, not leave it uncut, and I'm going to click OK. Okay, so now we have our eye feature here. And let me turn off the sketch because it's annoying. And let's go ahead and combine these two real quick. My target body is this. My tool body is my eye, and I'm going to cut, and I want to keep my tools. So if you remember the last video when we were doing the alignment pins, this is a very similar process. I'm basically making a post that I can glue my eye onto and then slide it into the lure body itself. That gives me access to the cavity while I'm cleaning, while I put any rattles in there that I want. It gives me an easy way to put the eye on externally off the bait before I put it together, and then I can just slide everything together at the end. Okay, so click on OK. So now let's rename this to eyeball. If we turn that off, you can see I have a nice hole in there now, right? And that's where I'm gonna glue that eye back in later. Okay, so turn that on, turn that on, turn that on, turn that on. And there we go. Now we can, let's go ahead and combine all these guys back together. Don't select the eyeball, we wanna join, and we don't wanna keep our tools around in this case. And that's gonna put basically the body all back together. So we're back to one body and our eyeball. Okay, one thing we should do on the eyeball real quick. So I'm gonna click this back face, hit F for fillet, make that 1.5-ish, I think. So that's the inside, it'll make it a little bit easier to slide in there later. So now what we're gonna do is put in place the pilot holes for the screw eyes for this particular lure. Yeah, I'll create a sketch. I can create on this face or I can create on this plane because they're all the same right now. And in this case, what I wanna do is I just wanna create a center line all the way through, okay? And that's going to be my first pilot hole for my front and back hangers. You could go all the way through with wire and use it for your line tie in the front and your hook on the back if you wanted to. I haven't tried to do that yet. We will in a future video, but just want to give you a heads up right here. And then the last one we want to do is the belly hook. And I'm going to go ahead and connect that as well. Just going to make sure we're all the way through. We're going to dimension this at an angle. I guess we can make it 60 degrees. Sure. All right. 21. 30. Okay, so we're all dimensioned there, and that looks good. The little engineer in me is excited that I'm fully constrained and dimensioned. Okay, we're gonna finish that sketch. We're gonna use our pipes. Select that guy, and we're gonna be 1.43 because that's what I'm using these days for the screw eyes I use. You'll need to figure that out with whatever screw eyes you're using, obviously. And easiest way to do that is just to make a very simple square model, put a bunch of holes in it, see which ones you like. There's a balance between too tight, where it will start to actually crack the resin, and obviously too loose that it wouldn't be holding the screws. So, you just gotta play around with it. So click on OK, bring our sketch back, click on the other pipe. We want this guy, same thing, cut, same distance, boom, and turn off our sketch. So now we're pretty much ready to go. Let's fillet this guy here. Just a little bit, 0.3 there, come to the back, 0.3 there, just a little touch on there. Okay, that looks good. Our eyeball is looking good. So again, I'm gonna stick my stick-on eye here. You could, if you wanted to, leave this as is. You could put a fillet on here if you want to make it kind of a round eye that's inset. That's something you could certainly do. You have a lot of flexibility here. I am working on completely 3D printed eyes as well that will look pretty cool. But in this case, since I'm sticking my eye on there, my eye is 10 millimeters and this is 10 millimeters, so I want to keep it somewhat straight. And I like kind of the pokey outy eye. All right, so now we're gonna get into a new trick that I've been using. We're ready to mirror these things. We're all done for now, right? We're not gonna put on details until we make sure that the lure actually performs the way we want it to. We don't wanna spend a lot of time on a lure that's not gonna actually perform. So let's mirror it. So we're going to create a mirror. We wanna do bodies, that body and the eyeball. Our mirror plane is the center, okay? And then we don't want to join, we want to do new body. And we don't want to join yet because we had our eyeballs selected and we don't want to join those together. Not all of them at least. And click on OK. So now we have 2 halves of our lure and 2 eyeballs. So what I actually want to do is hide this eyeball on the right, and I'm actually going to make the eyeball on the left part of the lure. And this can get tricky when you go to print, I'll show you, but in this case, I think we're gonna be okay. And I want one side to already have the eyeball kind of molded in because I only need access to one side to put my BBs in. I only need drainage from that one big hole in this one side of the eye. I don't need both of them. And it just makes a lot less work moving forward when I go assemble the lure. I only have to glue one eye in. And it also, by combining this eye in there, I can use this back face here to kind of hold that right eyeball in place from a distance perspective. So it's an all-around better idea. So now, of course, I want to combine all these together. Tutorial Twitch 1, and eyeball 1. Combine all of these together, join, don't want to keep tools. Boom. So now I can print this, print an eyeball, slide it all together, and I'm also going to get some drainage from these holes here. If we take a quick look at section analysis on the side here, you can see that my pilot holes that I ran all the way through this area, because I extruded that face there and brought it down even, this is also going to provide additional venting when I go to 3D print it, which is important. If I didn't have any venting in this cavity, you have to deal with suction forces in 3D printing because think of like a red Solo cup that comes down, sticks on like some saran wrap in water and tries to pull up. You create a vacuum there and it'll just rip your print right off the plate, which is not good. So we're all vented, we're all good. I think we're ready to print. Now let's go set it up in Chitu box and send it to the printer. All right, so we got these in. First thing I'm gonna do, uncheck select all, rotate, flatten by face, and I wanna click the filleted side of my eyeball there. And we can move him around, stick him over here, and let's make a couple of copies of him just for fun. Now I might be wasting a little resin here because I'm not sure that this lure is gonna work or this eye configuration is gonna work. So, if you're really tight on resin, maybe you don't wanna print 4 of these, but the reason I'm printing 4 is because if this works, then I don't have to print extras next time I go to print one of these models, right? I'll already have a couple laying around. Okay, so this guy, what I wanna do is rotate him, again, all the way over, just like that. And I think, only because I'm resin lapsing, I'm going to want to face him towards the front. That will be a little more exciting, I think. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Okay, that looks pretty good. So you can see right here with the eyeball, we're gonna have to support this area most likely, at least a little bit. But I'm not sticking that inside of anything. I don't have anything sticking inside of it. So whatever little bits I get left on from the support structure I'm gonna have to put there, really not gonna cause me a problem. All right, so we're gonna click supports. So I'm gonna start out with some light supports, and light supports on this nose area right here. You can see it's pretty red and the whole print starts here. So we want to make sure this little thin area at the start is pretty well supported, and I can use light supports at this point because when this prints, right, we're printing from the bottom, we're going to print those supports and then we're going to print a few layers of resin right there at the edge, and it's not going to be very heavy, so it's not really going to be holding up anything. As the lure progresses, it obviously gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and we're going to want to start using medium supports the more we go up. And this front part is going to be solid resin, remember, so it's going to get heavy pretty quick. So let's go ahead and, so you can see here, see how this is all black? That is one solid layer of resin, and it's going to be too thin to hold up if I don't support it right there. And so I want to make sure that I'm supporting as much of that area as possible, because it's really not going to be able to hold very well, and especially on that edge. Right, once it gets going, it'll probably be okay, but I want to make sure that we're good to go. Again, these are light supports. They're going to be fairly easy to remove and not leave a ton of residue. And I'm going to be putting an eyeball sticker over it anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so I think I'm good there. Let's go with start popping in some mediums. You might even want to think about doing like one heavy here, because this is the section that is going to be kind of holding most of the weight, or at least under the most pressure early on in your print. That's probably overkill. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to come back here and we want to kind of start supporting this area. And what I like to try to do is make sure that I'm in a relatively straight line all the way up the spine here, because this is going to support the weight as I'm printing. And I try to make them in a relatively straight line, not necessarily because it'll support better, although it probably does. It's more to make the sanding easier, because I'm going to have to sand this section with all these medium supports. So if they're all in a straight line, it's much easier to kind of sand them off smooth. I'm just going to keep going up, you know, like my philosophy is you're sanding anyways, so whether you have to sand, 15 or 20 of these off, it's not that much of a difference. And so I'd rather have a bunch on there to make sure that it's all going to print correctly. I think that is almost 100% overkill. Let's double check this eyeball here. Again, we want to make sure that that part's going to be successful, because if this part starts to fail, it's going to generate a bunch of like flakes of resin that are going to float around, probably increase the chances of the overall print failing, and it could also just kind of mess up the entirety of the rest of this side of the lure until things catch back up. I'd much rather over support and have a little extra cleanup than under support and have a bunch of failures. All right, I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to come and put a couple of more light supports here, just for giggles. Yeah, when this comes up, it can have some troubles forming this last big, I say big, I mean it's a relatively small gap, but you want to make sure that this doesn't fail here either, because if it does, you'll have not a good perfect circle, and so when you go to insert the eye post that we have, it's not going to fit. So we want to make sure we get these supported. And again, I'll have a little bit of sanding to do, but at least it will be a circle and not some weird shape. If I don't support this, it could collapse and have a weird shape. All right, now I just noticed my other problem here is going to be inside this guy. Okay, one thing you want to check before you go to print this thing is we have this eyeball inside, right? The one that we left in there to join. And a good way to check to see if that's going to print correctly or not is to come over here to the right side and drag this down. This is all your layers. And as it gets down there, you can rotate around and then kind of pull it back up and watch this thing build. And so there comes my eyeball. You can see the outside section of it here with my supports. It comes up, up, up. And when it starts to print, the portion I'm actually more concerned about is this inside portion, but it's not floating out in air, right? Because we just cut it out and then rejoined it. So the inside should print just fine because it has enough support around it as well. But if you have one that's kind of hanging out there, you're gonna have to get in there and do some funky supports. So try to make sure it's connecting properly and has some support as it's printing. All right, I think that's pretty darn good. Let's pull this down here. Make sure we don't have any bits floating in space. You'll see my cavity there. And, oh, I forgot one important thing. You want to make sure that the eyeball hole is close to the build plate, or, the bottom of this print, because it's going to provide a lot of venting for this, this cavity where we're going to have a lot of suction force. So you want to make sure that it is pretty early on in the print. If we would print this upside down, you know, the only vent we would have is this long hole from the top. And while that should be good, you know, sometimes the resin gets stuck in there, doesn't allow it to vent properly, and then you have a failed print. So that's the main reason I print it this way. You can see we come up, we start creating that cavity, and we immediately have some venting there. And then by the time our front pilot hole gets in there, you know, now we have two ways for the air to escape that vacuum. All right, so let's go back here. And for me, I'm just always gonna send at least two when I go to print, because if it works, that's great. I got two, I don't have to print anymore. If one fails and one works, then, you know, I got two of them there. And if both fail, well, I've wasted some time, but that's okay. I'm just gonna make sure that's selected and click copy. Let's just send let's send 4. Do I have enough eyes? Yeah, I got 4 eyes, so I'm gonna send 4 lures. Now, the sequence of that is somewhat important, right? I go and support 1 before I make a copy. That keeps the amount of work down. If I made 4 copies, I would then have to go support 4. So I support first and then make copies. All right, let's move these onto the build plates. Try to keep them somewhat away from the middle. That looks pretty good. 4 baits, 4 eyes. Let's send it. Oh, real quick. So this looks like it's going to take about 6 hours to print, cost us around $3.58, and take 99.55 milliliters of resin. So not bad. 4 lure blanks with eyes for about $3.50. Yeah, pretty good. So we've printed the new school layout. Let me show you how we put it together. So the great thing about doing it this way is that you have easy access to throw a ball. This is a 6 millimeter ball bearing, and I shove the eye in here. Let me show you how that works real quick. We have one eye that we have molded in place here, and then the other eye, just grab one of the eyes here. It's gonna slide in there, and this hole gives me access to the cavity that I can place whatever I want in there, or nothing at all if you want to go that route. Now, I don't actually know if this thing is going to float yet or not, and that's kind of one of the, I don't know if you want to call it downsides, but one of the issues you have to work through is to see how this is going to float, how it's going to fall, and you know, work the design based around the results of however you want it to work, right? So you have to kind of put together a few of them as prototypes before you get to the final one. And again, this is where I think 3D printing really shines, because I can produce multiple different versions of this relatively quickly. You know, right now I have this kind of, I'll call it version 1 with the bigger cavity. I have this version that I just took the cavity and shrunk it down considerably. That'll make a lot more weight. And then I had one that I printed 100% solid, right? There's no cavity at all, just to see how that worked. And so we can test these out really quickly. Also, you can test out, you know, different ball bearing configurations if you want to. This one has a bunch of little steel BBs, 177 BBs, and then the one we just did has 3 6 millimeter ball bearings. I have one with only 1 6 millimeter ball bearing, and I'm gonna glue this one up, which has no ball bearings at all. It's completely hollow. I don't have a lot of faith in the completely hollow one, but you never know. That's why we're testing. So I'm gonna glue these guys up, and then we're going to put our hook eyes in, put some hooks on them. Gonna put a light coat of clear coat on there. This is kind of a base coat, and to seal it all up, make sure there's no gaps like in the eyes or anything where water can seep in when we're testing it. And then we'll give them a test in the tank, and if one looks good in the tank, we'll sneak out to the pond and give it a test too. Oh, and real quick, you probably want to keep the super glue out of the chamber for the ones you have hollow chambered, because you don't want it to get on that ball bearing and then that ball bearing just to get stuck in there. I've screwed that up before. Yeah, those eyes really came out really, really great. Just pop right in there. Okay, sure I've glued all these guys up. While those eyeballs are drying, I'm going to take the solid printed one and walk you through the steps I use to get them to kind of the minimally viable stage where we can do some kind of float testing. All right, so the first thing we're going to do here is wander around aimlessly looking for crap, because that's what I do best. All right, so I'm just getting some wet dry sandpaper. This is 400 grits. Got a little cup of water I scooped out of my test aquarium over there. And we're just gonna wet sand this thing. Resin prints are relatively easy to sand. You don't need high grit, and you usually don't need a lot of elbow grease. So I got my yogurt cup here. I'm just like your mom used to be in collecting old food containers to use in the shop. It's got a little water from my aquarium. I have some 400 grit wet dry sandpaper and this solid lure mold. So the great thing about resin is it's super easy to sand, 3D printed resin at least, and it doesn't take a lot of effort. So we're just gonna dip this wet dry sandpaper in the water and sand away. Pretty simple. And since, I kept all of my supports mostly along this back ridge here, it's really, really easy to sand them down, right? I'm not having to adjust the lure, get weird angles or anything. I just come across the back of the lure here and it pretty much slicks off relatively easily. Again, 400 grit sandpaper, nothing crazy. You actually don't want to get too crazy because you don't want to start impacting the overall shape of the lure. And the next thing I'm going to do is just kind of go down the sides, just a touch, and just kind of clean everything up. One of the things that'll happen when you're washing and curing after the print is, sometimes you'll get fingerprints on there, you'll get little dings, before it's been cured. All kinds of goofy stuff will happen to it. And just a really light sand with a wet dry sandpaper will smooth that out. And the last thing we do is get that front edge where we had all those supports, make that nice and smooth. There we go. Sandpaper to the side, put this in the water, and just dry it off. Super simple. So give it one last look-see. Got a few little bumps in the back here. Knock those out. So you can see it's a little cloudy, but that'll go away as soon as we put clear coat on it, but it's nice and smooth, and that probably took me maybe like 2 minutes, tops 3 minutes. Way less time than if you're using an FDM printer where you'd have to sand the entire body. All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is put our screw eyes in. Now with this design, you could actually probably go all the way through with some through wire if you really wanted to make the connection from the nose to the tail 100% solid. Especially for now, like I don't really care about that. I've been using screw eyes for a while and they seem to perform just fine. So I'm actually working on getting some test equipment in so I can really test the strength of these screw eyes into the resin with super glue versus putting some 2-part epoxy resin in there to maybe putting nothing in there. But my drag is set pretty loose, so I haven't had anything break on me yet. And I really don't think it will. All right, getting it started, just grab it and I twist. So one thing I learned when I started doing this is, you have to really keep an eye on your pilot hole size. These are just kind of generic screw eyes I get, I think from Barlow's, and I have broken off a number of them just by, screwing them down into a lure. They seem to get kind of hot or, just the process of screwing it in really messes with the integrity of the metal part of the screw eye. So try to get it relatively straight. Just a little dab of super glue. Get it started, then I just grab my split ring pliers and twist it in. Makes it a little bit easier and goes a little bit faster. Probably should have put a close ring on there on the front. Oh well, that's why it's a test. All right, just let this one set up and then we'll go to clear coat. So before we tank test, we're just gonna take a little UV resin, put it in a cup and seal up those eyes to make sure we don't get any water penetration that will throw off our test. And all I'm testing for here is to see if they sink or if they float, and if they sink, do they sink fast, do they sink slow? I don't really know what I want for this bait. That's probably not a good thing. You probably know what you want out of a bait. It's the first switch bait I made, so I'm looking for something that's kind of sinking kind of fast, but not like a rock. I don't know what that is. I don't need too much of this. This is the just some UV resin I got, Counterculture DIY. I think it's commonly referred to as the Chinese UV resin. And I'm not looking for a nice coat here. I just literally want to make sure that no water gets into this gap here, which it probably wouldn't anyways, but just to be doubly sure, put some clear coat on it. So if the water gets in there when I go to throw it in the tank, it'll fill up with water and it'll sink really quickly, regardless of how it performs. And I just slide them under there. Oh yeah, this one has no rattles in it, so this is probably not going to work at all. Actually, I didn't even put, I just noticed I didn't put any hardware into this one at all, so at some point I gave up on it. That's okay. That's a solid one. And, oh, I think I got room for one more in there. Just mumbling and bumbling and stumbling. So obviously this step you only really have to go through when you're figuring out your design. When you finalize the design, you're just printing out a bunch of bodies, like you don't have to go through all this stuff. This is simply to make sure I have the right design or figure out that I don't have any of the right designs and I need to go back to the drawing board. Once you get it all sorted out, you're just gonna print them off and finish them however you want, right? Obviously with some clear coat and painting and magic and some more stuff we'll cover in a later video. Getting down for 60 seconds in there. This is just a little cheap nail UV light that I got, again, Counterculture DIY. I like their, they have some cool glitter there, which is why I found them in the first place, but found this on their site and it's pretty useful for this kind of UV curing where you just need to do something quick and dirty. And I do mean quick and dirty, this thing will only stay on for 60 seconds, so. All right, let's make sure we're fairly solid there. A little sticky, but we'll hit it for one more. All right guys, here goes the tank test for New School printed twitch baits. Crap, that's not what I wanted to have happen at all. All right guys, I don't know if you saw that, but when I dropped it in there, it kind of started sinking slowly, and then the back screw hole started filling with water. So I think I'm close to where I want this bait to be from a buoyancy standpoint. You know, I ended up printing 8 of these, you know, a plate with 4 and another plate with 4. And that's really kind of what you want to do when you're making any bait in any kind of style, is print a bunch of them at the beginning so you can kind of test and figure out, you know, how you want to weight them, where you want the rattles to be, all that kind of good stuff. If you're not going to put rattles in it, you know, maybe you don't need to print 4 of them. You can get away with just a couple, but you know, try to make the best use of your print time. It takes just as much print time to print one of these as it does to print 4, and the cost in resin is pretty minimal. Make the best use of your time. All right guys, version 2 was the clear go forward design. And that really emphasizes my point I made all through this process about not spending time on details until you get a working design. First design we had really didn't work under any circumstance. It was not floating well. I mean, maybe we could have figured it out how to make it work, but probably not. Version 2 is clearly superior design. And I didn't get that done until way later in the process. It was almost an afterthought. And if I would have spent a bunch of time figuring out all kinds of cool fins and scales and all kinds of funky stuff, we wouldn't have got to where we were today, and I would have had to redo a bunch of them when I went in and corrected my errors. Save your time, put it into testing, and now let's go do some details in this video right here. Take care, tight lines.